A trembling hand slipped a note to Big Shaq, and the whole store's reality shifted. Behind the checkout lane, shadows waited, danger whispered, and decisions loomed. Big Shaq didn't roar. Instead, his next move, silent yet seismic, stunned every corner of the store. The moment wasn't loud, but it was unstoppable. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask questions. It just moved. The sun sat clean above the tree lines, laying long shadows across the parking lot of a small-town grocery store in the outer ring of Atlanta. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed beneath the clatter of carts and casual chatter. Mothers negotiated cereal choices with toddlers. Teenagers bagged groceries without looking up. Life moved as it always did. Except today, something in the air didn't move quite right. Shaquille O'Neal, known to most in the area as Big Shaq, ducked under the entrance arch, like a man used to folding himself into small spaces. At 7'1", he was impossible to miss, but in this town, no one stared anymore. He wasn't the celebrity here. He was just Shaq, the guy who gave kids sneakers when their parents couldn't, who paid utility bills without anyone asking, who remembered birthdays better than most relatives. He was carved into the rhythm of this place like a familiar verse in a church hymn. He nodded at Walter, the security guard who always looked busy but rarely moved. "Morning, big man," Walter said, not even glancing up from his crossword. Shaq gave him a gentle tap on the shoulder with his knuckles. "Still stuck on 12 across?" Walter sighed. "Still think it's pineapple, but it don't fit." Shaq chuckled, the kind of deep rumble that made babies stop crying and cashiers smile. He moved with the careful pace of someone who knew his size could shake shelves. He passed the bakery, where the scent of warm cinnamon rolls dragged at his memory. Every Sunday morning when he was a boy, his mother, Lucille, made them just like that. Soft, sweet, perfect. He picked up a carton of almond milk, a bunch of bananas, and a few boxes of cereal, humming something slow and bluesy under his breath. In aisle 3, a kid with a ball cap glanced up at him, eyes wide. Shaq winked, tapped the kid's cap with one finger, and moved on. No selfies, no signatures, just presence. His presence was enough. The checkout lanes buzzed with chatter and beeping scanners. Shaq headed toward register 6. His usual. Lena was working it today. He knew her, early 20s, sharp-witted but quiet, always tucked behind that register like she was guarding secrets. Normally she greeted him with a smirk and a dry joke. Not today. Today Lena's hands shook as she scanned the bananas. Her eyes kept flicking, not to him but behind him, like she was expecting someone to tap her shoulder. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. She didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't even look him in the eye. Shaq noticed. He didn't say anything at first, just placed his items down slowly, methodically, giving her time. She dropped the cereal box once, muttered an apology, picked it back up with fingers that looked like they'd been running from something. "You all right, Lena?" he asked. Voice low, warm, like a blanket. She nodded too quickly, eyes darting again. "Yeah, just long morning. That's all." But Shaq knew the weight of a lie. He'd heard enough to recognize when one cracked mid-sentence. Lena wasn't all right. Something sat heavy on her shoulders, like words she wasn't allowed to say. He watched her bag his groceries with a kind of care that felt rehearsed. He didn't push. Pushing was for people who needed fast answers. Shaq had learned to wait. People opened up when they knew you weren't trying to pry them open. She handed him the receipt, folded in a neat square, slipped between her trembling fingers. Her eyes finally met his, just for a second, long enough to say something without a word. Then she turned away quickly and called out the next customer. Shaq paused. There was something in that moment that didn't sit right. He could feel it, deep in the part of his gut that had never failed him, on the court, in life, in rooms full of people pretending to smile. He walked out slowly, groceries in hand, but the folded receipt in his palm felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just paper, it was a message. Out in the parking lot, Shaq sat in his Escalade for a moment. No music, just breathing. Then carefully, he unfolded the paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a note. "Help. He's watching. Don't leave." The words were written in a hurried scrawl, smudged on the edges, as if folded too fast. Shaq's jaw tightened slightly. He looked up, back at the store's front doors. Inside, everything looked normal. People shopping, talking, walking. But now, every movement felt like a layer peeled back. He glanced to his left and noticed a man near the loading bay, half hidden in shadow, leaning against a stack of crates, dressed in all black. He wasn't looking at the trucks. He was watching the glass doors, watching Lena. Shaq didn't move. Not yet. He'd seen trouble before. Real trouble. The kind that didn't shout, it whispered. The kind that didn't need fists to leave bruises. This felt like that kind of trouble. He wasn't the law. He wasn't a detective. But he was something else. A man people trusted. And when someone like Lena handed you a note with shaking hands, you didn't ignore it. You didn't walk away. Shaq rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. Heart steady, mind already working. He wouldn't rush, wouldn't panic, but he sure as hell wasn't leaving. Not today. Shaq moved toward the checkout, the rhythm of his steps unhurried, but his eyes already scanning the space with the ease of someone who'd always been aware of what was happening around him. The morning was supposed to be simple: grab a few groceries, share a few laughs with familiar faces, maybe offer some advice about the latest high school game. But the tremor in Lena's hands said otherwise. He placed his basket on the counter, watching as Lena tried to maintain her usual composure. She scanned the almond milk too quickly, the carton almost slipping from her grip. The bananas followed, but her fingers twitched, the produce nearly tumbling to the floor. He could see the sweat on her forehead, the way her jaw clenched too tightly. Her movements were mechanical, forced, as though she was working through a storm only she could see. Shaq didn't rush her. He let her take her time, knowing from years of watching people under pressure that forcing them to move faster only made them break. His own mother, Lucille, used to tell him that patience wasn't just waiting. It was understanding when waiting could save a life. He stood quietly, his sighs both imposing and gentle, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Then it happened. As Lena slid the last item across the scanner, her fingers dipped into the bag, and he saw a small slip of folded paper tucked between the cereal boxes. Her hands trembled, a barely audible crack in her voice, as she whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't just polite. It was a plea wrapped in a word too small to carry the weight it bore. Shaq's heart slowed, his senses sharpening like the edge of a knife. He gave her a nod, his expression calm, but his mind was already dissecting the moment. He didn't need to open the note right there. He'd seen enough of life to know urgency could be a trap. Instead, he gathered his bags, his large hands steady, his gaze catching Lena's for a brief, silent exchange. In that second, her eyes spoke volumes: fear, desperation, hope, and then she quickly turned to the next customer, her hands still trembling as though trying to shake off the weight of what she had just done. As Shaq turned to leave, he felt the heavy drag of curiosity laced with responsibility. His steps were measured, carrying him out of the automatic doors, but his mind was racing. The crisp air outside didn't cool his thoughts. In the parking lot, the sunlight slanted through the windows of his Escalade, casting fractured shadows across the dashboard. He slid into the driver's seat, placed the groceries on the passenger side, and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel. The note remained untouched in the bag, but its presence pulsed against his awareness like a ticking clock. The usual sounds of the parking lot, shopping carts clattering, muffled conversations, blurred into the background as he finally reached into the bag and pulled out the slip of paper. He unfolded it with the same deliberate care he used when handling fragile things. The words were scrawled hastily, ink smudged at the edges, but their meaning was clear enough to punch the air from his lungs. "Help, he's watching. Don't leave." Shaq's pulse quickened, but his face remained an impassive mask, honed over years of public life where panic had no place. He glanced back toward the store, the windows catching sunlight and revealing only shadows within. But shadows could lie. His instincts whispered that something was off inside, something hidden beneath the mundane bustle of groceries and morning errands. He scanned the parking lot, his gaze sharp yet unhurried. It was then he noticed a man, standing near the side entrance by the loading bays, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the stacked crates and delivery carts. The man's posture was too casual, his gaze too fixed on the front of the store. He wasn't waiting for a delivery. He wasn't browsing his phone. He was watching. Shaq didn't know the man's name, didn't need to. What mattered was the intent carved into the set of his shoulders, the slight lean of his body as if ready to move. The man's presence added a layer of tension that hummed beneath the surface of the ordinary day, stretching the air tight around Shaq's lungs. He exhaled slowly, his mind sifting through possibilities. He wasn't law enforcement. wasn't some undercover agent, but he was a man who had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was cornered. Lena had slipped him that note because she believed he could help, and she was right, not because he was a hero, but because he understood the weight of silent pleas and hidden desperation. His mother's voice echoed softly in his mind, a memory of lessons whispered late at night. If you see someone drowning, you don't wait for permission, you save them. Shaq weighed his options. Walking back in immediately might draw attention, spook Lena, or alert the watcher that his cover had been compromised. Leaving, though, that wasn't an option. The note wasn't a request for a favor. It was a cry for help from someone trapped in plain sight. He tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel, his mind sharpening into quiet focus. Every decision from here had to be calculated. There was no room for grand gestures, no place for reckless action. It would take patience, subtlety, and timing. He knew how to play the long game, to shift pieces without showing his hand. His mind flicked through the layout of the store, the angles of sightlines from inside, the proximity of exits. His size was an advantage. His presence could distract, buy time, but only if used precisely. The man by the loading bays shifted slightly, eyes scanning the lot before returning to the front entrance. He was waiting for something, or someone. Shaq's gut told him it wasn't a delivery. Maybe Lena's shift was almost over. Maybe she'd planned to leave, but couldn't. Whatever the reason, she believed that slipping a note into a bag was safer than speaking out loud. That alone was enough to tell Shaq the danger was real. His jaw set, the decision crystallizing in his mind. He wouldn't leave, not until he understood the full picture, and not until Lena was safe. With a final glance at the store, he folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket like a contract signed without words. He reached for his phone but stopped himself too soon for calls, too soon for backup. He needed more information. He needed to move like the giant he was, but with the grace of someone who knew the weight of each step. The sun climbed higher, its light slicing through the windshield, but Shaq's thoughts were already a few steps ahead. Whatever was happening inside that store, it wasn't going to end with him driving away. Not today. Shaq sat in the Escalade, the air conditioning humming softly against the rising heat of late morning. His large hands held the note, its edges creased and damp where his grip had tightened. The words were simple but carried the weight of silent desperation. Help. He's watching. Don't leave. He glanced back through the windshield, his gaze narrowing toward the glass front of the grocery store, its automatic doors sliding open and shut as customers trickled in and out. At first glance, it all looked ordinary. Shoppers juggling bags, kids whining about snacks, cashiers chatting over barcode scanners. But Shaq wasn't looking for what was obvious. His attention was locked on the shadows, on the subtle tension that curled around the edges of normalcy. His eyes found the shadowy figure near the stockroom, half concealed by stacked boxes of inventory, and a narrow hallway that led to the back of the store. The man wasn't just standing there. He was poised. His posture radiated control, but not the kind that comes from authority. It was the control of someone used to making others nervous without raising their voice. Shaq recognized it from locker rooms, boardrooms, places where silence said more than shouting ever could. The man's stance was calculated, relaxed enough to seem casual, alert enough to act if needed. Shaq's mind raced through possibilities. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions. But Lena's message was clear. The man in the shadows wasn't just watching customers. He was watching her, and now, by extension, he was watching Shaq too. He weighed his options with a cool head. Bursting back into the store would only draw attention, possibly spook the man and put Lena in more danger. Calling the police now, with nothing more than a hastily written note, might waste precious time and tip off whoever was orchestrating this tension. He needed more information, a clearer sense of the game being played. His size made him impossible to miss, but his patience was his advantage. Sliding the note into his pocket, he stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the store with measured ease. His movements were deliberate, controlled, not hurried, not hesitant. He made sure to project the casual energy of a man who'd simply forgotten something, perhaps a carton of eggs or a loaf of bread. The doors parted for him with a quiet whisper, and he stepped inside, the coolness of the air conditioning brushing against his skin. Inside, the store felt different. The brightness of the fluorescents seemed harsher, the conversations more hushed. He kept his gaze moving without locking eyes with anyone, noting subtle shifts in body language, the way Lena's shoulders tensed at the register, the furtive glances she cast toward the stockroom. The shadowy figure wasn't in direct sight now, but Shaq knew he hadn't left. He could feel the man's presence like a weight pressing against the walls, shaping the air itself. Shaq positioned himself near the magazine rack, a spot with a clear line of sight to both Lena's register and the stockroom hallway. He picked up a sports magazine, flipping through it absent-mindedly, all while keeping his peripheral vision sharp. Every few minutes he noticed a flicker of movement near the back, someone slipping in and out of the shadows, checking something on a clipboard, but always watching the floor. Lena's hands moved quickly now, scanning groceries with the precision of someone trying to finish a shift without drawing attention. But Shaq could see the tremor hadn't gone. Her eyes darted to the stockroom every time a shadow shifted near the back. He could almost hear her thoughts pleading for him not to leave, for someone to notice the silent call for help. A sudden motion caught his eye. The shadowy figure stepped partially into view, leaning toward a young stockboy, carrying a box of canned goods. The man's lips moved, but the words didn't carry. The stockboy nodded too quickly, his face pale, and scurried off toward the loading bay. The man Shaq caught the hint of a name badge now, half obscured by his jacket. Caleb watched him go, then turned his attention back to Lena. Caleb's presence was a threat not through overt aggression, but through the silent pressure he exerted on everyone around him. Shaq had seen men like this before, ones who didn't need to shout or swing fists to leave scars. Their power came from suggestion, from knowing exactly how to make others second-guess their safety. The realization twisted in Shaq's gut, hardening his resolve. He couldn't confront Caleb directly. Not yet. The risk of drawing attention was too high. Instead, he needed a way to stay close, to observe without becoming a target himself. He wandered toward a nearby display of discount baked goods, picking up a pack of cinnamon rolls, feigning casual interest while his ears tuned to the muted sounds of the store. He heard Caleb's low voice exchanging words with another employee, something about inventory logs and delivery schedules. But the tone was too smooth, too controlled. Shaq knew he wasn't just talking shop. A new tension filled the air. When Caleb's gaze flicked toward him, their eyes met briefly. Caleb's sharp, assessing, like a predator taking the measure of potential prey. Shaq met the gaze evenly, offering a faint, almost disinterested nod, before turning his attention back to the cinnamon rolls. He sensed the calculation in Caleb's expression, a weighing of possibilities. Caleb retreated into the stockroom, disappearing behind the stacks of boxes. Shaq set the cinnamon rolls down, his mind ticking through strategies. He couldn't just stand here forever. He needed to understand what Caleb was planning, and more importantly, he needed to find a way to let Lena know she wasn't alone. A thought struck him, simple, subtle, but effective. He approached the bakery counter, pretending to browse. Quietly, he slipped his phone from his pocket and opened a notes app. With quick, practiced fingers, he typed a message. "Stay calm. I'm here. Don't let him see you panic. Watch for my signal." Then, timing it perfectly, as Lena passed by to restock paper bags near the bakery, he left his phone on the counter, screen illuminated, angled just enough for her to catch the message. As she glanced down, Lena's reaction was almost imperceptible. A fractional stiffening of her shoulders, a slight tilt of her head, but it was enough. Shaq retrieved his phone, pocketing it smoothly, and moved back toward the front of the store. Caleb might think he was just another shopper, but Shaq was playing the long game, every move deliberate, every step calculated. The air in the store felt heavier now, like it knew the tension woven into it was about to snap. But Shaq was ready. He wasn't just a giant in stature, he was a quiet force, waiting for the right moment to shift the balance. And he wasn't leaving. Not until this ended. Shaq leaned against a support column near the produce section, blending into the store's casual rhythm, as he observed Caleb Knox emerge from the stockroom, his movements precise, controlled. Caleb's tall, lean frame wasn't physically imposing in the way Shaq's was, but his presence cut through the air like a blade pressed to the throat of everyone nearby. He wore the veneer of a calm, collected professional, a clipboard tucked under one arm, a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, but the tension in his shoulders and the calculated sharpness of his glances betrayed the truth. Shaq's gaze followed Caleb as he moved purposefully toward Lena, who was hastily restocking a shelf of paper goods near the back. The slight tremble in her hands returned, her posture stiffening as she sensed Caleb's approach. Shaq didn't need to hear their words to understand the dynamic at play. It was etched in the tightness of Lena's jaw, in the careful way she kept her eyes averted. Caleb leaned in slightly, his voice low but urgent. his tone that of a man accustomed to making demands without raising his voice. Shaq caught snippets as he edged closer, pretending to inspect a display of cleaning supplies. Caleb's voice, though low, had a razor-sharp precision that cut through the ambient store noise. "You think I don't see you, Lena? You think I don't know what you've been doing?" His tone was soft, but it carried a weight that made Lena's spine straighten. She whispered something back. Shaq couldn't catch the words, but it was clear from her trembling hands that she was trying to placate him. Caleb's smirk twisted, his lips curling with an almost imperceptible threat. He leaned in closer, his breath brushing her ear, and her face blank. Whatever he said next made her retreat a half step, but she held her ground, her fists clenched at her sides. Shaq's mind tightened like a fist. The pieces were falling into place. Caleb wasn't just a threat today. He'd been a looming shadow in Lena's life for months, exploiting her, coercing her into silence, drawing her deeper into a web she couldn't escape. Shaq could read the tension in Lena's stance, the weight of months, maybe years of quiet fear. Caleb wasn't the type to get his hands dirty directly. He operated through leverage, through whispers in the stockroom, through threats no one else could hear. Shaq's gut clenched at the realization. Caleb's operation was slick, hidden beneath layers of legitimate business. Stolen merchandise rerouted through backroom shipments, falsified inventory reports, cash skimming off the books. He'd coerced Lena and probably others into compliance, using threats to ensure silence. Shaq's jaw tightened as he imagined the fear Lena must have felt every shift, trapped in plain sight. But charging in now, fists swinging, wasn't the answer. It wasn't his way, and it wasn't what Lena needed. She needed an ally who could stand tall, without setting off alarms, who could counter Caleb's quiet threats with something even more powerful: calm, steady resolve. Shaq adjusted his posture, straightening up and casually making his way down the aisle, pausing to examine a display of discounted batteries. From this vantage point, he could watch Caleb and Lena without being obvious. Caleb was growing more agitated, his gestures sharper now, his voice dropping lower but carrying a venomous undertone. Shaq caught the flash of something, a small envelope. Caleb discreetly passed to Lena, his hand brushing hers just long enough to send a silent message. She took it, her hands trembling as she slipped it into her pocket, her eyes darting nervously around the store. That envelope wasn't a gift. It was a leash. Shaq's instincts told him it likely contained money. Hush money or evidence of some deeper entrapment. Either way, it was a symbol of Caleb's control, a weight meant to keep Lena tethered to his scheme. Shaq's moral compass flared, a quiet heat rising in his chest. This wasn't just a petty theft ring, it was systemic exploitation. Caleb had built a machine that operated on fear and silence, using people like Lena as cogs to keep his secrets safe. Shaq's hands curled loosely at his sides, his stance deceptively relaxed as his mind worked through the angles. Confronting Caleb directly would risk everything: Lena's safety, the fragile balance of the store's routine, and Shaq's own position. But letting this continue wasn't an option. He needed to intervene subtly, shift the balance without tipping it over. A plan began to take shape in his mind. He needed to create a disruption, something small but significant enough to draw Caleb's focus elsewhere, giving Lena a chance to breathe, to regroup. Shaq scanned the store, noting the placement of employees, the flow of customers, the proximity of the front doors and exits. His mind calculated possibilities like a chessboard, each piece representing a potential move. He moved deliberately toward the customer service counter, where a teenage employee was struggling to restock shelves of promotional flyers. Shaq leaned in, his voice low and friendly. "Hey kid, can you do me a favor? Looks like somebody dropped a bag of oranges near the back. Might be a hazard. Could you check it out?" The teenager, eager to please, nodded and hurried off toward the back room, leaving his post unattended. Shaq used the moment to pick up a flyer, pretending to read it while subtly watching Caleb. The slight distraction worked. Caleb's attention flickered toward the teenager's movement, his body tensing just enough for Lena to step back from him, her shoulders relaxing fractionally. Shaq didn't push the advantage too hard. He let the distraction simmer, letting Caleb's attention split between the unexpected movement and his original focus. He wanted Caleb off balance, just enough to fracture his control without drawing overt suspicion. As Caleb glanced toward the front of the store, Shaq made brief eye contact with Lena, offering the smallest nod of reassurance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her she wasn't alone in this. Her lips tightened in a faint, determined line, and she turned back to her register, her hands a little steadier now. Shaq turned away, his mind spinning with strategies. Caleb wasn't going to give up easily. But Shaq had already planted the first seed of disruption. The next move would require precision, patience, and a deeper understanding of Caleb's operations. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was preparing for a quiet confrontation, one that would dismantle Caleb's control without a single punch thrown. And Shaq, with his quiet strength and unwavering presence, was just the man to do it. Shaq stepped back into the store, like a man who'd simply remembered something he couldn't leave behind. His frame filled the entrance, sunlight trailing in behind him before the glass doors whispered shut. His face was relaxed, his smile easy, the same charm that had disarmed boardrooms and locker rooms alike, now smoothing over the ripple of tension he carried inside. On the surface, it was an ordinary errand, a casual return for a forgotten item. But beneath that calm exterior, Shaq's mind was a machine, clicking through possibilities, recalculating every angle of the store's shifting dynamics. The checkout lanes hummed with the rhythm of commerce, and Shaq's slow, confident steps drew nods and greetings. A couple of regulars called out to him. A security guard near the front tipped his head, but Shaq gave little more than a warm nod in return. His attention wasn't for them today. His eyes were tuned to the edges, the spaces where shadows gathered, where things were meant to stay unnoticed. Near the back of the store, Caleb Knox emerged from the narrow hallway that connected the stockroom to the delivery bay. His movements were slick, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the floor as if expecting something, or someone to interfere. Shaq noticed the quick flick of Caleb's hand as he passed a small wrapped package to a delivery driver lingering by the loading dock. The exchange was fluid, practical. The driver, mid-30s, wiry build, a ball cap tugged low over his brow, nodded once and pocketed the package, disappearing down the corridor with the nonchalance of someone used to slipping between the cracks. Shaq's gut clenched. This wasn't just about Lena. This was bigger, deeper. Caleb's operation wasn't a lone man's game. It was a network, a quiet flow of goods and favors slipping through the store's veins, hidden beneath the mundane. He moved further into the store, picking up a box of crackers from a nearby shelf, as if debating a snack choice. His large hands cradled the box absent-mindedly, but his mind was razor-sharp. He tracked Caleb's path, watching as the man lingered by a low counter near the stockroom entrance, his posture deceptively casual, his conversation with a junior employee just a shade too long, too smooth. It was clear Caleb was maintaining his cover while orchestrating a larger play. Shaq needed to shift the balance, to create just enough disruption to tilt Caleb's focus. He approached the front of the store where an older employee, Marla, a fixture of the store with her beehive hairdo and thick-rimmed glasses, was organizing stacks of promotional signs. He greeted her warmly, his voice carrying the easy cadence of familiarity. "Hey Marla, how's the back room looking today? Y'all still missing that shipment from last week?" Marla looked up, adjusting her glasses. "Oh, Shaq, it's been a mess. Stuff's been going missing. Papers ain't lining up. I swear if they don't get new management in here, we're gonna lose half the stock before the month's out." Shaq's smile was laced with sympathy, but his eyes stayed sharp, catching the way Caleb's posture stiffened across the floor. The casual mention of missing shipments was enough to send a ripple of unease through Caleb's carefully constructed calm. Shaq leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Maybe I should come back here more often. Seems like someone needs to keep an eye on things." Marla chuckled, a light familiar sound, but Caleb's gaze darted toward them, his jaw tightening. Shaq had struck a nerve. Without saying Caleb's name, without calling him out, he'd injected just enough tension into the atmosphere to put the man on alert. Now came the delicate part. Shaq shifted his attention toward Lena, who was restocking a nearby shelf of canned goods. Her hands were steadier than before, but her shoulders remained tense, the weight of Caleb's silent threats still pressing down. Shaq caught her eye, a subtle nod that carried layers of meaning. He couldn't speak outright, couldn't risk drawing attention, but the message was clear. "Stay sharp. Watch my lead. We've got this." Lena's lips parted in a faint, almost imperceptible exhale. She adjusted a row of cans with a deliberate slowness, signaling her readiness to follow. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Caleb, then back to Shaq. In that brief exchange, trust was forged, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet resilience of two people deciding to stand against a storm. Shaq returned his gaze to Caleb, now engaged in a forced, too cheerful conversation with a delivery clerk near the loading bay. Caleb's gestures were overly animated, his laugh a fraction too loud. It was the behavior of a man trying to cover his tracks, to reassert control when the edges of his operation were fraying. Shaq's mind clicked into place. He didn't need to confront Caleb outright. Not yet. What he needed was to create enough noise, enough subtle misalignment, to draw eyes in the right direction, without tipping Caleb off. He moved toward the deli counter, placing an order for a large tray of cold cuts he didn't need. The clerk disappeared into the back to prepare it, leaving the counter unattended. With precise timing, Shaq accidentally knocked over a display of sample cups nearby, the crash echoing through the quiet hum of the store. A few customers turned their heads, curious but not alarmed. Caleb's head snapped around, his expression tightening for a brief second, before smoothing into practiced indifference. Shaq bent to pick up the cups, his large frame filling the space, effectively blocking Caleb's view of Lena for a few crucial moments. Lena used the opening. She stepped closer to a side counter where Caleb had left a clipboard filled with delivery logs and schedules. With a swift glance around, she flipped a few pages, her eyes scanning the contents. Then, with subtle precision, she slipped a folded piece of paper, her own silent note beneath the top sheet before returning to her register. Shaq caught the motion, a flicker of pride rising beneath his careful calm. Caleb's attention snapped back to Shaq, but the damage was done. The dynamic had shifted, the game's rhythm disrupted. Caleb's control was no longer seamless, no longer invisible, and Shaq, with his quiet, deliberate steps and easy smile, had just moved the first piece on a board. Caleb didn't even know he was playing. As Shaq gathered his unnecessary cold cuts and returned to the front of the store, he felt the shift in the air. The tension had deepened, the suspense coiling tighter, but he knew this was only the beginning. Caleb's operation wasn't as airtight as it appeared, and with each subtle move, each quiet exchange of glances, Shaq was dismantling it from the inside out. Without a punch thrown, without a word of accusation, he had taken control of the narrative. And he wasn't done yet. Shaq had felt the shift in the store's atmosphere, the sudden tightness, the faint tremor of anticipation humming beneath the ordinary shuffle of carts and beeping registers. He believed he was steps ahead, orchestrating subtle moves to tip the scales in Lena's favor, each small action carefully calculated. But as he rounded a corner near the refrigerated aisle, his plan, as neatly constructed as it was, began to fray at the edges. He found Lena crouched by a low shelf, restocking cartons of milk with the same mechanical precision she'd used earlier. But now her movements were less hurried, more deliberate, as though she were waiting for someone, for him. When she glanced up and caught his eye, something unspoken passed between them, an urgency sharp enough to slice through the layers of their unspoken alliance. "Shaq?" she murmured under her breath, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. He leaned closer, his size shielding her from any prying eyes. Her voice dropped lower, her words quick and clipped, every syllable edged with a desperation that belied her calm exterior. "You don't understand. I'm not just caught up in this, I'm part of it." For a split second, Shaq's mind stumbled, struggling to reconcile her words with everything he'd seen. The shaking hands, the whispered plea, the terrified glances. But Lena pressed on, her voice a hurried, urgent confession. "I'm not a victim. I'm undercover. I was sent here months ago to gather evidence on Caleb's operation. The note I gave you, it wasn't just a cry for help. It was a test, to see if you'd help, to see if you were someone who could be trusted." Shaq's pulse surged, but he kept his expression steady, his voice low. "A test?" Lena nodded, her eyes flickering toward the back of the store, where Caleb's shadow lingered near the stockroom. "Caleb's not just running a side hustle with stolen goods. He's tied into something bigger, laundering through fake shipments, moving cash through shell companies. I was sent to infiltrate, to get proof, but he's getting suspicious. He's been tightening security, watching me closer. I thought I had more time, but," her voice cracked, barely above a whisper, "I think he's planning to cut me out, permanently." The weight of her words settled over Shaq like a heavy shroud. He'd thought he was stepping into a scenario where he could play the quiet hero, subtly dismantling Caleb's operation through misdirection and resolve. But now the stakes had shifted. Lena wasn't just an employee caught in Caleb's web. She was a plant from a secret investigative unit, working alone, isolated, with her cover fraying at the seams. Shaq's mind raced, recalibrating. The casual exchanges, the trembling hands, they were part performance, part survival. And Caleb's sudden paranoia wasn't misplaced. He must have picked up on subtle cues, cracks in Lena's cover, shifts in her behavior too minor for anyone else to notice, but enough to make him wary. And wary men in Caleb's position didn't just wait for things to play out. They acted. "Listen," Lena said urgently, her hand brushing his arm as she tried to steady her voice. "I've been gathering data, delivery schedules, financial discrepancies, evidence of shipments routed through fake companies. I've almost got enough to blow the whole thing open. But if Caleb decides I'm a liability, it's over. For me and for the case." Shaq's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking toward the stockroom, where Caleb's silhouette loomed like a specter. The man's movements were sharper now, his conversations clipped, his eyes scanning the store with a predator's focus. He wasn't just watching Lena anymore. He was watching Shaq too. The easy familiarity Shaq had wielded to navigate the store's dynamics was now a double-edged sword, drawing attention he couldn't afford. "We need a plan," Shaq said quietly, his voice a low rumble that resonated beneath the surface of their hushed conversation. "A real one. No more subtle moves. No more waiting for the perfect moment. You've got the evidence. I've got the present. Together we can turn this around before he makes his move." Lena's breath hitched, a mix of fear and relief flashing across her face. "There's a secure line I can use. I just need to get to the manager's office without Caleb noticing. If I can transmit the data I've gathered, my team can move in. But I can't do it alone. I need cover. I need a distraction big enough to pull Caleb's attention completely away from me." Shaq's mind worked through the layout of the store, the flow of customers, the choke points where a well-timed diversion could fracture Caleb's focus. His pulse remained steady, his voice even as he spoke. "I'll give you that distraction. When I move, you don't hesitate. Get to the office, make the call, and don't look back. No matter what happens out here, you finish this." Lena nodded, her eyes steady despite the tension bracketing her mouth. "Are you sure? If he figures out you're helping me, you'll be in danger too." Shaq offered a faint smile, the kind that carried the weight of experience. "I've faced worse. Besides, I'm not about to let a man like Caleb tear you down after everything you've risked. We've got a shot to end this, Lena. Let's make it count." The finality of their exchange hung in the air, as they straightened, slipping back into their respective roles, the tired cashier and the forgetful customer. But beneath the surface, the game had changed, irrevocably. Shaq wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was a key player in a game of shadows, one where the stakes were higher than he'd imagined, where a single misstep could shatter the fragile balance Lena had fought so hard to maintain. As Caleb's sharp gaze flicked toward them, his expression calculating, Shaq felt the tension coil tighter around his spine. The next move would decide everything. The success of Lena's mission, the exposure of Caleb's network, and their own survival. Shaq squared his shoulders, his mind already shifting into high gear. The twist had come, the rules had changed, and now, more than ever, he needed to stay 3 steps ahead. And he would. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Shaq stood at the end of aisle 7, the cold tiles beneath his sneakers, a grounding force as his mind churned through possibilities. The stakes were clearer now. Lena wasn't just a cornered victim. She was a whistleblower, sitting on the edge of exposure. Caleb's sharp gaze cut across the store like a hawk's, and Shaq knew the man wouldn't hesitate to silence her the moment the risk outweighed the reward. But brute confrontation wasn't the answer. Not here, not with customers drifting between shelves, the quiet hum of ordinary life cocooning a sinister undercurrent. Shaq's size and reputation were assets, but they could also be a liability, if used recklessly. He needed to disrupt Caleb's focus, without outright violence, or drawing attention to Lena's real intentions. He glanced at her where she stood by the bakery counter, her posture deceptively composed. She met his eyes briefly, just long enough for a flicker of shared understanding to pass between them. She was ready. She just needed the window, the sliver of time to slip through the tightening noose. Moving deliberately, Shaq made his way toward the beverage aisle near the back of the store. He picked up a case of bottled water, bulky, unwieldy, the kind of thing that would draw a second glance if fumbled. He carried it toward the stockroom entrance, the route cutting directly across Caleb's line of sight. Caleb's sharp eyes flicked to him, narrowing with suspicion, as Shaq's massive frame momentarily blocked his view of Lena. It was a calculated risk. Shaq adjusted his grip on the case, letting it teeter slightly in his hands as though the weight was catching him off guard. His foot nudged against a display of stacked juice bottles positioned a little too close to the narrow corridor leading to the stockroom. The deliberate misstep was subtle but effective. The case of water slipped from his grasp, crashing into the display with a loud, clattering explosion of rolling bottles and splashing juice. The sound ricocheted through the store, an abrupt rupture in the carefully maintained hum of commerce. Heads turned, startled customers froze mid-step. Conversations halted. Caleb's posture stiffened, his hands balling into loose fists at his sides. The quiet predator had been pulled into the open, his gaze snapping between the disrupted display and Lena's station by the bakery. Shaq bent to gather the scattered bottles, his movements slow, exaggerated, drawing more attention as customers murmured and glanced his way. He didn't rush. He let the moment stretch, the tension thicken, the distraction bloom into a minor scene of disarray. Caleb's irritation was visible now, his carefully controlled facade cracking just enough to reveal the pressure he was under. Meanwhile, Lena seized the opportunity. She slipped away from the bakery counter and moved toward a side corridor that led to the manager's office, her steps quick but quiet. Her body language was casual to the untrained eye, but Shaq recognized the urgency in her stride, the way she kept her shoulders loose to mask the tension coiled in her frame. She clutched a small folder evidence she'd gathered, pressed against her side as she disappeared around the corner. Caleb's eyes followed her movement, his suspicion sharpening into something closer to alarm. He stepped away from the stockroom entrance, his voice low but edged with threat as he spoke into his earpiece, likely summoning one of his cronies. His gaze snapped back to Shaq, narrowing with realization. The friendly giant had turned into an obstacle, a distraction he hadn't accounted for. Shaq straightened, brushing juice from his hands, his expression easy but his pulse thrumming beneath the surface. He locked eyes with Caleb, across the scattered chaos offering a lopsided grin. "Guess I'm a little clumsy today," he said loud enough for nearby customers to hear, his tone light, even self-deprecating. A few patrons chuckled nervously, the tension dissipating slightly as the scene settled into something explainable, a minor accident, nothing more. But Caleb wasn't laughing. His posture remained rigid, his jaw tight as he weighed his next move. He couldn't act overtly, not with so many eyes on him, not with Shaq standing between him and the stockroom, like a silent wall. The threat was now mutual and unspoken. The longer Shaq held the stage, the more the store's rhythm fractured. Customers lingered, curiosity piqued by the unusual disruption. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, some murmuring to each other, wondering why Caleb was suddenly so tense, why a simple spill had rattled him so deeply. Caleb's voice, low and clipped, murmured into his earpiece again. A stockroom attendant, nondescript, average build, emerged from the back, eyes darting nervously as he approached Caleb. The message was clear. Caleb was consolidating his forces, preparing to tighten his grip. Shaq decided to push the disruption further. He turned to the nearest employee, a young guy stocking shelves with an air of distraction. "Hey man, think you can grab a mop? Made a mess back here," Shaq called out, his tone deliberately loud and friendly. The employee nodded, hurrying off toward the back. Another ripple of disruption, another moment Caleb couldn't control. The trap was working. Caleb's focus was split, his control fraying at the edges. Lena was likely already in the manager's office, transmitting the evidence through the secure line she'd mentioned. Shaq just needed to hold Caleb's attention a little longer, long enough for the data to leave the store, for the truth to start unraveling Caleb's operation from the inside. Shaq adjusted his stance, blocking the corridor with casual ease, his presence as solid and unyielding as a mountain. Caleb's glare sharpened, but his hands stayed at his sides, his mouth tightening into a thin, pale line. No physical violence. Not here. Not now. The battle between them was silent, waged through glances, gestures and the measured weight of presence. The murmurs among the customers grew louder as the minutes stretched. A manager appeared near the front of the store, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene. Caleb's jaw clenched, his calculations shifting with every beat of Shaq's calm defiance. The trap was sprung, the tension coiled so tightly that the air itself seemed ready to snap. And through it all, Shaq remained the calm center of the storm, waiting, steady, determined, because he knew that when Caleb finally realized the full scope of what had just slipped through his grasp, it would be too late. Lena would be gone, her evidence transmitted, her story unstoppable, and Caleb's empire of shadows would begin to crumble. The tension in the store, once hidden beneath the ordinary shuffle of carts and hum of idle chatter, had now thickened into a palpable weight. Shaq stood near the scattered mess of juice bottles and water cases, casually righting them, his movements deliberate, the picture of calm despite the electric charge humming beneath his skin. His stance was relaxed, his presence undeniable, and his eyes tracked every shift in the store's subtle dance. Caleb Knox didn't move toward him immediately. Instead, he lingered near the stockroom entrance, his expression unreadable but the clench of his jaw betraying a rising frustration. Shaq could see the calculation behind his gaze, the weighing of risk against reward, the instinct to assert control over a situation slipping from his fingers. Finally, with the air between them tightening like a rope, Caleb strode forward, his steps quick and controlled, his posture casual to anyone else's eyes but heavy with threat. "Hey," Caleb said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge, the kind of tone that feigned friendliness while testing boundaries. "Looks like you had a little accident here." Shaq straightened, towering over him, but kept his expression light, a small grin playing at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, clumsy me," he said, his voice a rich, easy rumble. "Guess I underestimated the power of gravity." Caleb chuckled, but it was a thin sound, hollow and strained. He stepped closer, too close for it to be casual, his voice dropping. "Funny, I couldn't help noticing you've been lingering. Most folks don't hang around after knocking over a display." Shaq met his gaze evenly, the weight of his calm pressing against Caleb's brittle facade. "Most folks wouldn't notice a display falling either. But you're not most folks, are you?" The thin veneer of Caleb's smile cracked, just slightly, enough for a flicker of frustration to show in his eyes. "I like to keep an eye on things, make sure everything's running smooth. You understand?" Shaq's voice dropped, quiet and steady, threading through the charged air like a low current. "Sure, I keep an eye on things too, like who's making a mess and who's just cleaning it up." Caleb's smirk twisted, his posture tightening. But before he could retort, a subtle shift caught Shaq's attention, a flicker of movement near the front office where Lena had slipped away. The shadow of a figure behind the frosted glass of the manager's door signaled she was in position, transmitting the evidence she'd risked everything to gather. Shaq let a slow breath fill his chest, his voice still low but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "You've got a lot on your plate, Caleb. Looks like you've been running this place a little too smooth, if you ask me." Caleb's mask dropped for a split second, replaced by something sharper, colder. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a threat woven beneath false camaraderie. "You don't know what you're walking into, Shaq. This isn't your fight." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone easy, almost conversational. "You're right, it wasn't. But now it is." He let the words hang, the calm assertion of a man who knew he held the upper hand, not through threats or force, but through unwavering resolve. Caleb's eyes flickered, a shadow of realization dawning behind the thin veil of his smirk. His gaze darted toward the front office, then back to Shaq, the edges of his composure unraveling. "You think you've got this figured out? You think you can stop what's already in motion?" Shaq's smile was faint, but resolute. "I don't need to stop everything. Just you." As the words settled between them, a sudden burst of motion near the front of the store drew attention. A clerk waving for a manager, the buzz of a phone ringing behind the counter. The ripple of normalcy fractured, and in that instant Caleb's instincts took over. He turned, his movements sharp and panicked, his gaze snapping toward the front office. He realized too late that Lena wasn't just transmitting evidence, she was triggering the collapse of everything he'd built. Caleb bolted, cutting through the aisles with the reckless speed of a man cornered. His sudden flight sent a ripple of surprise through the store. Customers turned, startled gasps rising, as carts rolled aside. Shaq didn't move to chase. He didn't need to. His eyes followed Caleb's retreat, his pulse steady, knowing that every step the man took was tightening the trap already set in motion. Lena's silhouette flickered behind the frosted glass, the faint glow of a monitor illuminating her face as she completed the transfer. Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line of determination. Caleb's network was already compromised, the evidence leaving the store as he ran. There was nowhere left for him to hide. A few employees, confused by the sudden shift, exchanged murmurs, some beginning to move cautiously toward the scene. Caleb's sprint slowed, the weight of realization crashing down as he saw security near the exits, summoned quietly by the disruption Shaq had orchestrated. His path was cut off, his options narrowing to nothing. Shaq stepped forward, not running, just walking with the calm gravity of a man who knew he had already won. Caleb turned back, his expression a mask of desperation and fury, but it was too late. His empire of shadows was exposed, and his grip on the store's silent fear had snapped. The tension that had stretched so taut between them finally broke, not with a shout or a crash, but with the quiet, inevitable collapse of a man who had played his hand and lost. Caleb's steps faltered, his shoulders sagging, his eyes darting frantically, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Shaq stopped a few paces away, his voice low but carrying in the sudden hush. "It's over, Caleb." For a long moment, the store held its breath. And then, quietly, Caleb surrendered, not to Shaq, not to the store's employees, but to the inevitable weight of his own unraveling. As security approached, Shaq stepped aside, his presence a silent reassurance to Lena, who emerged from the office with her shoulders squared and her eyes steady. The battle wasn't won with force, but with resolve, patience, and a quiet, unshakable belief in doing what was right. The store had never felt so loud, not with the clang of carts, the murmur of customers, or the soft beeps of barcode scanners. This noise was different, a low, pulsing wave of shock rippling through the aisles as flashing blue and red lights cut through the glass storefront. The sharp, mechanical whoop of a siren faded as two marked police cars slid to a halt outside. Doors flew open, officers emerging with the focused precision of people who already knew what they were walking into. Shaq stood still near the center of it all, his presence like an anchor in a sea of rising tension. His breath was steady, his shoulders squared, his calm a stark contrast to the sudden rush of adrenaline spinning through the store. Customers craned their necks, murmuring in low voices as they registered the arrival of law enforcement. The casual bustle of shopping had transformed into something taut, the air vibrating with questions unspoken but loud enough to fill the space. Caleb's attempt to slip through the side exit had already failed, his path cut off by two uniformed officers moving in unison, flanking him with practiced ease. His sharp, calculating expression flickered into one of resignation, the realization of his dwindling options sinking in, as he was quietly but firmly directed to step aside. His hands remained at his sides, his jaw tight, but his control had evaporated like mist in sunlight. Lena emerged from the manager's office, her steps measured, her spine straightened into a quiet defiance that caught the eye of every customer nearby. She no longer looked like the nervous cashier fending off a predator in plain sight. Her eyes were steady, her grip on the slim folder of evidence unshaken. She approached the nearest officer, handing over the documents with the crisp efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment more times than she cared to admit. Shaq's gaze followed the handoff, the shift of power marked not by violence but by truth. The officers flipped through the folder briefly, their expressions tightening as they absorbed the weight of the contents. With a few clipped words exchanged over radios, backup was requested. The quiet, insidious network Caleb had cultivated within the walls of the store was crumbling, not with fists, but with facts, with the quiet strength of a woman who had risked everything to make sure the truth couldn't be buried. Caleb's voice finally cracked through the heavy air, low and bitter. "You think this changes anything?" His words were directed at Lena, but his eyes flicked toward Shaq, unable to disguise the grudging realization that the man he had dismissed as a harmless bystander was in fact the silent architect of his undoing. Shaq didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried through the tension like the low roll of distant thunder. It already did. The officers moved in, their hands light but firm on Caleb's arms, guiding him toward the exit. He resisted for a breath, his chest rising sharply, as though he might fight, but the weight of reality settled too heavily on his shoulders. He allowed himself to be let out, his head ducking slightly, as though trying to disappear into his own shadow. The store's customers stood frozen, their faces a collage of disbelief and quiet respect. Whispers spread, threads of the story weaving together, as they pieced it all together. The quiet tension, the strange exchange of glances, the sudden unexpected arrival of police, and at the center of it all, the man they knew simply as Big Shaq stood calm and unmoved. His role in the unfolding drama, revealed not by words but by the quiet confidence of his presence. A manager, wide-eyed and stammering, approached Shaq as the officers escorted Caleb away. I didn't realize what was going on," he said, his voice thick with the weight of hindsight. Shaq gave a faint, almost rueful smile. "Most folks didn't. That's how it works." His tone wasn't accusing, just quietly matter-of-fact, carrying the unspoken weight of too many people missing the signs, until it was almost too late. Lena moved to stand beside him, her expression tired but triumphant. She glanced up at Shaq, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Thanks," she said softly, the single word carrying layers of meaning. Gratitude for his presence, for his unflinching support, for his ability to turn the tide without ever stepping into the spotlight. Shaq shook his head, his voice low. You did the hard part. I just made sure you had the chance. The murmurs in the store grew louder, customers beginning to move again, the frozen tableau dissolving into cautious movement. Some offered Shaq nods of acknowledgement. Others whispered to each other, their glances shifting between him and Lena. Rumors would spread, stories would grow, but the truth remained rooted in the quiet strength of their actions. Outside, Caleb was led into the waiting squad car, his figure framed against the backdrop of flashing lights and curious onlookers. The door shut with a quiet finality, the engine growled softly, and the car pulled away, leaving behind the fragments of an operation built on secrecy and coercion. Inside, Shaq exhaled slowly, his hands loose at his sides, his posture easing for the first time since Lena had slipped him that trembling note. The fight was over, not with fists, but with patience, resolve, and the quiet courage of standing firm in the face of danger. As Lena handed off the final pieces of evidence to the officers, she glanced back at Shaq one last time. Their eyes met, an unspoken understanding, passing between them. There was still work to be done, repercussions to face. But for this moment, they had won. Shaq turned toward the automatic doors, his steps slow and deliberate. The morning sun had shifted, the light slanting through the glass in long golden rays. Customers parted slightly as he moved through, some offering quiet words of gratitude, others just watching, as if trying to understand how a man so large could move with such quiet grace. And as he stepped into the sunlight, the air fresh and cool against his skin, Shaq allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Not a grin of triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of a job done right. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The store returned to its hum of everyday life, behind him. But the story of the quiet giant, who had stood his ground, would linger in the whispers of those who had witnessed it. The store had settled into a hush, a fragile quiet left in the wake of flashing lights and departing officers. The air was thick with the remnants of adrenaline, the sharp edges of whispered speculation lingering beneath the surface of normalcy. Shaq stood near the front, the space around him subtly cleared by the cautious steps of customers who weren't quite sure what to say. His hands rested lightly on his hips, his posture easy yet grounded, as if he were waiting for something. Lena approached, her steps deliberate, her shoulders squared. The exhaustion in her eyes was edged with relief. But there was something more, a hint of resilience, of a weight finally set down after too many months of silent fear. She held a thin folder of remaining evidence, now useless except as a symbol of what had been risked and what had been saved. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of sincerity. "I couldn't have done this without you." Shaq met her gaze, his expression warm but modest, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "You did what needed to be done," he said, his voice a low rumble of quiet conviction. "I just gave you the space to do it." Lena's lips quirked in something halfway between a smile and a grimace. "That's more than most would have done. You could have just walked away." Shaq's gaze shifted to the glass doors, where sunlight spilled across the floor in golden slants. He watched the silhouettes of customers moving outside, the ordinary world resuming its quiet rhythm. "Some things you don't walk away from," he said almost to himself. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his mind, the lessons of compassion and integrity etched deep into the core of who he was. Lena hesitated, her fingers tightening on the folder. "I should have told you the truth from the start," she admitted. "About why I was here, about what I was doing." Shaq turned back to her, his eyes steady. "You told me when it mattered," he said. "That's enough." His tone carried no bitterness, only a calm acceptance that sometimes people had to protect themselves before they could ask for help. The quiet stretched between them, filled with a sense of resolution that didn't need more words. Around them, the store stirred back to life, employees resuming tasks, customers resuming conversations, but the weight of what had happened lingered, a subtle current that rippled beneath the surface of normalcy. Lena glanced toward the now empty stockroom, her voice dropping. "Caleb's just one part of it. There are others, bigger operations, higher up. This was just the first piece." Shaq's brows lifted slightly, his curiosity piqued, but he didn't press. "You'll take them down too," he said, quiet confidence threading his words. She nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "With people like you around? Yeah, we'll get there." Her lips pressed into a thin line of resolve, the weight of unfinished business settling on her shoulders. But this time she wasn't alone. Shaq glanced around one last time, his gaze sweeping over the store, the people, the subtle shifts in atmosphere. The customers were starting to speak again, their whispers threading into a collective narrative. About the big man who had stood firm, about the cashier who'd been braver than anyone had guessed. He could hear snippets, words like hero and quiet giant murmured under breath, hints of admiration tinged with awe. But Shaq didn't bask in it. He never had. Instead, he offered Lena a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of shared victory, then stepped toward the doors. The sunlight caught him full in the face as he crossed the threshold, the warmth a welcome contrast to the chill of the store's air conditioning. Outside, the world continued as if untouched. Cars gliding down the street, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in a soft breeze. Shaq stood for a moment, letting the air settle around him, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady but distant. The hero's glow wasn't for him. He'd never sought it, never needed it. The satisfaction was in knowing the right thing had been done, quietly, without fanfare. Behind him, Lena lingered at the doorway, watching as he moved down the sidewalk. Her voice, low and almost reverent, carried just far enough for him to hear. "You're not just a big guy, Shaq. You're the one who makes the difference when no one else will." He didn't turn, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He tipped his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her words, and continued down the sunlit path. But just as the story seemed to settle into its quiet ending, a shift occurred. A dark sedan, parked unobtrusively at the edge of the lot, caught Lena's attention. The driver, a man in a crisp suit with mirrored sunglasses, watched the scene with cool detachment. His expression gave away nothing, but the slight tilt of his head toward Lena was enough to send a prickle of unease down her spine. She straightened, her hand tightening on the folder at her side, the resolve in her eyes hardening. This wasn't over. Caleb had been a piece of a larger puzzle, and somewhere out there, others were watching, waiting, calculating their next move. Shaq paused at the edge of the parking lot, glancing back as if sensing the shift. His gaze met Lena's for a brief, unspoken moment, an understanding that their paths might cross again, that the fight wasn't truly finished. Then he turned back to the sunlit street and kept walking, his figure gradually blending into the backdrop of everyday life. The whispers of his quiet heroism lingered in the store behind him, a story passed from mouth to mouth, growing softer with each retelling. But Lena knew the truth, that the real strength wasn't in the size of the man, but in the steady, unwavering way he chose to stand for what was right. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind him, Shaq O'Neal walked away, not as a celebrity, not as a man seeking praise, but as the quiet hero who'd left the world just a little better than he'd found it. If you think this was just a story, think again. The shadows lurking in everyday places are closer than you realize. Stay sharp, stay aware, and remember, heroes aren't born, they're made in the quietest moments. Ready to see what's next? Dive deeper, because the story isn't over yet.